She was not born a goddess, but she became one. In a world ruled by men, in an age when a woman's power was measured only by her silence and her submission, she defied every expectation, shattered every boundary, and carved her name so deeply into the stone of history that even 2,000 years later, we cannot stop speaking it. Her name was Cleopatra, and this is not the story you think you know. Forget the Hollywood seductress draped across a golden couch. Forget the perfumed temptress whose only weapon was beauty. Because the real Cleopatra was something far more dangerous, far more brilliant, and far more human than any myth has ever captured. She was a polyglot who spoke 9 languages at a time when most rulers never bothered to learn even one foreign tongue. She was a mathematician, a philosopher, a naval commander, a political strategist, and a queen who held together a crumbling empire through sheer force of intellect and will. She ruled the wealthiest nation on earth at a time when Rome itself was tearing apart at the seams, and she understood instinctively that Egypt's survival depended not on armies alone, but on alliances, on diplomacy, and on the calculated use of every asset at her disposal. She loved not weakly, but fiercely, forging bonds with the 2 most powerful men of her age, not out of desperation, but out of choice, out of vision, out of a relentless pursuit of a world where Egypt would stand sovereign and eternal. And in the end, when everything she had built crumbled and the last option left was surrender, she chose death on her own terms rather than humiliation on Rome's. This is the full story of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, and it begins not in Egypt, but in the mind of a man named Alexander. Because without Alexander the Great, there is no Cleopatra. And without understanding the world she was born into, her story makes only half its true sense. In 332 BC, Alexander of Macedon swept into Egypt, not as a conqueror in the traditional sense, but as a liberator, freeing the Egyptian people from Persian occupation and being welcomed with open arms by a population who saw in him not a foreign invader, but a divine savior. Alexander understood the power of symbols, and so he traveled to the oracle at Siwa, deep in the Libyan desert, where the priests of Amun declared him the son of a god, a declaration he neither rejected nor entirely embraced, but wore like a cloak of legitimacy over everything that followed. He founded Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast, a city that would become the intellectual capital of the ancient world, home to the greatest library ever assembled, a beacon of philosophy, science, mathematics, and art that drew the greatest minds from across the known world. And then Alexander died young, at 32, and his vast empire, stretching from Greece to India, was carved up by his generals, the men history calls the Diadochi, the successors, and one of them, a Macedonian named Ptolemy, claimed Egypt for himself, establishing the dynasty that would rule for nearly 3 centuries and end with Cleopatra. The Ptolemies were Greek by blood, but Egyptian by ambition. They adopted the titles of pharaohs, built temples in Egyptian style, worshipped Egyptian gods alongside their own, and positioned themselves as the rightful continuation of a civilization that stretched back 3,000 years. But for most of their dynasty, the Ptolemies spoke Greek, thought in Greek, and governed for Greek elites, never troubling themselves to learn the ancient language of the people they ruled. That would change with Cleopatra, and that change would be one of the most significant political acts of her reign, though it is rarely given the credit it deserves. Cleopatra VII Philopator was born around 69 BC, the second child of Ptolemy XII, the man Roman satirists nicknamed Auletes, the flute player, a nickname that captured their contempt for a king they viewed as weak, dependent, and obsequious. Ptolemy XII was indeed a man caught in an impossible position. Egypt was enormously wealthy, producing grain that fed much of the Mediterranean world, exporting papyrus, linen, glass, and luxury goods that made Alexandrian merchants fabulously rich. But Rome was growing, hungry, and dangerous, and Ptolemy XII understood that the only way to protect Egypt's independence was to secure Roman recognition of his legitimacy. To do that, he paid. He paid staggeringly, borrowing vast sums from Roman bankers, imposing crushing taxes on his people, and eventually being driven from his throne by an outraged Egyptian population who saw him as a puppet of Rome. He fled to Rome itself, leaving his eldest daughter Berenice on the throne, and spent years lobbying, bribing, and politicking his way back to power, finally returning with Roman soldiers in 55 BC to reclaim his kingdom and execute Berenice with a cold efficiency that made clear he was not as weak as his reputation suggested. It was into this world of dynastic intrigue, Roman pressure, and political violence that young Cleopatra grew up, and she watched and learned everything. She watched her father's humiliation and understood that Egypt's wealth was simultaneously its greatest asset and its greatest vulnerability. She watched Rome's appetite grow and understood that the question was never whether Rome would come for Egypt, but only when and on whose terms. She learned languages, immersing herself in Egyptian, Ethiopian, Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabian, Parthian, and Latin alongside her native Greek, and in doing so, she became something no Ptolemaic ruler before her had ever been, a pharaoh who could speak directly to her own people, without interpreters, without intermediaries, in the ancient tongue that had sung prayers to Isis and Ra for 3,000 years. The political significance of this cannot be overstated. When Cleopatra stood before Egyptian priests and spoke their language, she was not merely demonstrating a skill, she was declaring herself one of them, the genuine continuation of a civilization, the incarnation of Isis herself, divine and inseparable from Egypt's identity in a way her ancestors had never managed. When Ptolemy XII died in 51 BC, he left his kingdom jointly to 18-year-old Cleopatra and his 10-year-old brother Ptolemy XIV, following the Ptolemaic tradition of sibling co-rule that was as politically convenient as it was personally bizarre. Ptolemy custom also often involved sibling marriage, and Cleopatra and her young brother were nominally husband and wife as well as co-rulers, a dynastic arrangement that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with legitimacy. From the beginning, Cleopatra acted as sole ruler in practice, issuing decrees in her own name, conducting foreign policy independently, and making clear by every action that she viewed her brother as a figurehead rather than a partner. The boy king's advisors, particularly a eunuch named Pothinus and a general named Achilles, resented her dominance deeply and began almost immediately to scheme against her. The tension between Cleopatra and this faction simmered for 3 years before erupting into open conflict around 48 BC, when Cleopatra was driven from Alexandria, her life in danger, her power stripped, and she found herself raising an army in the Syrian desert, preparing to fight her own brother for control of Egypt. It was precisely at this moment, when Cleopatra's fortunes were at their lowest ebb, that the Roman world came crashing into her story with the force of a tidal wave. 2 men had been fighting for control of Rome, the greatest rivalry of the ancient world, and it was about to land directly on Egyptian soil. Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, once allies through the political arrangement known as the First Triumvirate, had gone to war with each other, and Caesar had won the decisive Battle of Pharsalus in Greece. Pompey fled to Egypt, believing that Ptolemy XIV, whom he had once supported, would offer him sanctuary. Instead, Ptolemy XIV's advisors made the catastrophically miscalculated decision to murder Pompey as he stepped ashore, presenting his severed head to Caesar where the Roman general arrived in Alexandria days later, apparently believing this would please him. It did not. Caesar wept, or at least made the politically wise display of weeping, and made immediate clear his disgust at the murder of a Roman consul.